It's August in Mississippi, 1856. The kind of heat that doesn't just sit on your skin, it crawls inside you. It gets into your lungs, into your bones, into the spaces between your thoughts. The air smells like cotton dust and red clay and something else underneath it all. Something older, something that the land itself seems to be holding onto, like a secret it doesn't know how to release. Now imagine you're standing in a field, white cotton stretching in every direction as far as you can see, all the way to a sky so blue it almost looks fake. And in that field, among hundreds of people bent at the waist, fingers bleeding, backs breaking under a sun that shows absolutely no mercy, there is a child. She's 9 years old. She weighs maybe 50 pounds. Her fingers are cut from the sharp edges of the cotton balls, and her back hurts in a way that no child's back should ever hurt. She doesn't cry. She doesn't sing. She doesn't even really talk. She just works. Slowly and carefully and as invisibly as she possibly can, because invisible is the safest thing you can be in a place like this. Her name is Sarah, and in 3 days she will be dead, and then 3 days after that she will climb out of her own grave. Now stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the most impossible, most deeply human stories I have ever come across. A story that was whispered about for generations in the communities that survived it, but never truly spoken out loud. A story about what happens when a system built on treating human beings as numbers in a ledger pushes too far and something pushes back. This is the story of Sarah Sutton, and I promise you, by the time we're finished, you will never forget her name. You have to understand the world Sarah was born in, too, before you can understand what happened to her. Not just the broad strokes of history that you learned in school, but the specific, suffocating, daily reality of life at a place called Blackwood Plantation in Yazoo County, Mississippi. Blackwood belonged to a woman named Margaret Sutton, a widow, 48 years old, tall and thin with gray eyes that people said never seemed to blink. She had inherited the plantation when her husband died in 1852, and she was absolutely determined to prove that she could run it better than any man. And in a certain cold, terrible sense, she succeeded. She kept meticulous records. Every bale of cotton, every expense, every person who lived and worked on her land, all of it entered into leather, bound ledgers in her precise handwriting. You see, to Margaret Sutton, Blackwood was not a community. It was not a home for the 300 people who lived and suffered and loved and died on its grounds. It was a business, and the people who worked it were, in her mind, inventory, assets to be maintained, depreciated, and discarded when they stopped producing sufficient returns. In 1856, a healthy adult enslaved man was valued at approximately $1,200. A strong woman, $800 to $1,000. Children were valued lower, their prices rising as they grew and proved they could work. And in Margaret's ledger, listed with the same detachment she might use to record the purchase of a new plow, was Sarah Sutton, valued at $250, less than a quarter of an adult worker. Sarah was born on that plantation in 1847, the daughter of a woman named Ruth. Ruth died bringing Sarah into the world, and Margaret's husband, without a trace of human feeling, noted in his records that Sarah's birth had been a net loss of $650. That was the first sentence ever effectively written about Sarah Sutton's existence, a calculation of loss. From her very first breath, she was marked as a problem. She was small, she stayed small. She grew slowly no matter how much she ate, which was never enough to begin with. Her eyes were large and dark, and carried something in them that made the adults around her uncomfortable, a kind of heaviness, like she understood more about the world than any child should. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was so quiet that people had to lean in close to hear her, which meant getting close to those eyes, which made people uneasy in ways they couldn't always explain. The overseer, a man named Coleman Briggs, called her dead weight. Briggs was 35 years old, built like something carved from anger, and he had built his entire professional reputation on his ability to extract maximum labor from human beings through fear and pain. In 6 years at Blackwood, he had increased cotton production by 40%. He had also buried 23 workers in that same period, including 7 children. Margaret considered this an acceptable cost of doing business, but Sarah confused Briggs in a way that genuinely bothered him. You can't break someone who never fights back. You can't instill fear in someone who already seems to have surrendered to the world entirely. So he just pushed her harder, made her work through meal breaks, assigned her to the hottest, most punishing rows in the field, stood over her criticizing, mocking, sometimes striking the back of her head when her small hands moved too slowly. He told her she was worthless. He told her she was stealing from the plantation just by being alive. And Sarah, small, silent, bleeding, fingered Sarah, just kept working. There was an old woman named Esther who watched all of this and tried, in the quiet and stolen ways that love survives in impossible places, to do something about it. Esther was in her 60s, had been at Blackwood for 40 years, had given birth to 11 children on that land. 8 of them had been sold away. 3 had died in childhood. She had earned the plantation thousands of dollars in the marketplace of human beings, and now that she was old and worn, she was valued at $150. Barely more than the sick child she tried to protect. Esther would sneak Sarah extra portions of her own rations. She would help her with tasks when Briggs wasn't watching. At night, when Sarah woke up screaming from nightmares she never talked about, Esther would hold her until the shaking stopped. She told the other women in the quarters that Sarah reminded her of a bird with a broken wing, still alive, but not really flying, just surviving each day barely, waiting for something to change. There was also a young man named Daniel, 20 years old, strong and smart, and worth $1,200 in Margaret's ledger. He would try to help Sarah in the fields, carry her cotton sack when it got too heavy, take over her row when she fell behind. And every time he did, Briggs would punish them both, because solidarity among enslaved people was exactly what men like Briggs spent their lives trying to destroy. Let them help each other, and they might start thinking of themselves as a community, and a community has power. And power was the one thing Margaret Sutton could absolutely not allow. Now I need to tell you about August 15th, 1856. Because this is the day everything begins. The sun rose hot and merciless at 5 in the morning. The bell rang. Sarah dragged herself out of the small cabin she shared with Esther and 5 other women, a 16 by 20-foot space with no windows, no furniture except rough sleeping platforms, no privacy, no comfort. She had been coughing more lately, a dry, deep cough that brought up flecks of blood. Esther said it was the cotton dust getting into her lungs. She had seen it happen before. A child starts coughing and slowly, over months, over years, they just waste away. By noon, Sarah had picked 15 pounds of cotton. Her daily quota was 75. Her fingers were bleeding. The sun was merciless. She had been given 1 cup of water at sunrise and would not receive another until sunset, 12 hours later. Margaret had calculated that water breaks reduced productivity by 8%. The cost of the occasional worker who collapsed from dehydration was lower than the cost of the lost efficiency. When Briggs rode through on his horse and grabbed Sarah's nearly empty sack, his face darkened. He dragged her to the center of the field, publicly, deliberately raised his whip, and prepared to do what he had done to her many times before. And then Sarah Sutton simply fell, not dramatically, not with a cry or a struggle. She folded into the Mississippi dirt like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And she didn't put her hands out to catch herself, and she didn't make a sound. Her eyes rolled back, her body went completely limp, and she lay there in the red clay of that cotton field, barely breathing. Daniel broke free from his row and ran to her before anyone could stop him. He pressed his hand to her chest and felt her heartbeat, wrong, irregular, frightening. "She's dying," he told Briggs. "She's dying right here. Let her die somewhere with shade. Give her at least that much." Briggs worried more about paperwork and blame than about the child herself. Had Sarah carried to the plantation house? The doctor was sent for. Thomas Merritt, 70, 2 years old, had been practicing medicine through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. He knelt over Sarah's small body on the floor of the plantation house, on the floor, not on a bed, because beds were for white patients, and he examined her briefly. Fluid in the lungs, fever burning so hot her skin was painful to touch, blood retreating from her hands and feet as her body desperately tried to protect its core. Multiple organ systems shutting down simultaneously. Margaret stood in the doorway and asked the question she always asked, "Can you fix her?" Dr. Merritt gave her the numbers. $5 for medicine, perhaps another $5 in lost productivity from whoever had to nurse her. $10 total to try to save a girl worth $250, with less than a 1 in 3 chance of success. Margaret did the calculation in the same time it takes most people to blink. "Don't waste the medicine," she said. "If she dies, she dies, God's will," and she went back to her roasted chicken dinner. By 6 that evening, Sarah was worse. By 8:30, she stopped breathing entirely. "Doctor." Merritt checked her pulse 3 times, held a mirror to her mouth, and watched it stay perfectly clear, pressed his ear to her chest, and heard absolute silence. He signed the death certificate at 8:35 p.m. He recorded her as entry number 437 in his medical ledger. Margaret was informed during her meal. She barely looked up. "Have them bury her behind the barn," she said. "No point wasting space in the cemetery. Do it quickly in this heat, not in the cemetery with the proper headstones and maintained plots. Behind the barn where they buried dead animals, where broken things were thrown away and forgotten." Briggs organized 2 workers, James and Moses, who dug a hole 4 feet deep in silence, because they had done this before, and there was no good way to make it anything other than what it was. They wrapped Sarah's small body in a piece of old canvas that had been used to cover cotton bales. No coffin. Coffins cost money, no ceremony, because Briggs wouldn't allow it. By 10 o'clock, Sarah Sutton was in the ground. 4 feet of Mississippi soil between her and the world. The grave was unmarked. The dirt was already starting to settle. Esther watched from the quarters with tears streaming down her face. Daniel stood beside her, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. "She deserved better," he whispered. "She deserved so much better than this." And then the bell rang to signal curfew, and they went back inside, because the work bell would ring again at 5 in the morning, and life at Blackwood Plantation did not pause for grief. 3 days passed. August 16th, cotton picked, quotas enforced. Margaret entered Sarah's death in her business ledger. Sarah Sutton, age 9, died August 15th, 1856. Loss of asset value, $250. A tax write-off, a line item, August 17th, the same. And then came August 18th. The night was hot and still, no breeze, no relief even after the sun went down. Most people at Blackwood were asleep by 9 o'clock, exhausted from another day of brutal labor. The few who were still awake, sitting outside trying to find some cooler air, heard it first. A scraping sound coming from the direction of the barn. At first they thought it was an animal, a dog maybe, or a raccoon. But then the sound became more deliberate, more purposeful, and the dogs, all 6 of them, all at once began to bark. Not their normal territorial bark, something different, something that raised the hair on your arms and made your stomach tighten without knowing exactly why. The kind of sound dogs make when they sense something that violates the natural order of things. One of them urinated from sheer terror and wouldn't move an inch closer to the barn. James, one of the house servants, grabbed a lantern and went to see what was happening. He walked around the side of the barn slowly, holding the light high. He saw the 3 small mounds where people had been buried over the past 2 months. 2 of them were undisturbed. But the third one, the newest one, was different. The dirt had been disturbed from below. And as James got closer, holding the lantern with a hand that had started to shake, he saw something emerge from the darkness at the edge of the light. A small hand, pale in the moonlight, fingers moving, grasping, pulling upward. And beneath the hand, a face covered in dirt, eyes open, mouth gasping for air. Sarah Sutton was climbing out of her grave. James' scream cut through the night like a blade. People came running from every direction, from the quarters, from the main house, carrying lanterns and torches, demanding to know what had happened. He couldn't answer. He just stood there pointing, his mouth moving without any sound coming out. Coleman Briggs arrived first, rifle in hand, ready for any kind of trouble he could understand. He pushed through the crowd. He saw what James was pointing at, and the rifle slowly lowered. His face went pale in the torchlight, because Sarah Sutton was pulling herself up and out of the earth, both hands gripping the edge of the hole, thin arms straining with the effort, dirt cascading off the canvas that still wrapped her small body. Her hair was matted with soil. Her dress was torn and stained with 3 days of burial. 40 people stood in a semicircle around that grave and watched something that none of them could explain, something that none of them would ever fully be able to describe. But her eyes, that's what everyone would remember later. Her eyes were open, and they were clear, and they were focused in a way they had never been during her life. There was something in them, a depth, a weight, a knowing that made grown men and women feel suddenly small. She looked around at all those shocked faces, making eye contact with person after person, and what was in her gaze was not fear or confusion. It was recognition. She pulled herself completely out of the hole and stood on shaky legs beside her own grave. And for a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sounds were the dogs still howling from a safe distance, and the crackle of torches in the dead, still air. Esther broke first. She pushed through the crowd, fell to her knees in front of Sarah, and reached out with trembling hands. "Child," she whispered, "is that really you? Are you really alive?" And Sarah looked down at her, this old woman who had given her extra food in secret, who had held her through nightmares, who had mourned her death, and she nodded. "Yes, Esther, it's me. I'm alive. I came back. Not I survived, not I woke up. I came back. Doctor." Merritt was hauled out of bed and dragged to the scene. He arrived breathless, stumbling, and when he saw Sarah standing there, he went white as chalk. Someone had to grab his arm to keep him upright. He had pronounced her dead. He had signed the certificate. He had been absolutely certain. He grabbed her wrist with trembling fingers. Her pulse was there, strong, steady, perfectly normal. He listened to her chest, regular heartbeat. He checked her lungs, clear, no fluid, no pneumonia. He checked her eyes, responsive, normal. Her temperature, warm, natural, no fever. He whispered, more to himself than anyone, "This is impossible. You were dead. I checked. You had no heartbeat, no breath. You were cold. You were gone by every standard I know." And Sarah looked at him with those ancient, clear eyes and said simply, "You weren't wrong, doctor." "Merritt, I was dead. My heart stopped at 8:35 p.m. on August 15th, but death isn't always the end. Sometimes what's gone can come back." Margaret arrived then, wrapped in her robe, furious at being woken in the middle of the night. She pushed through the crowd demanding explanations. And when she saw Sarah, she stopped, her mouth opened. Her brain refused for several long seconds to process what her eyes were showing her. And then Sarah Sutton, 9 years old, 4 feet tall, 50 pounds, a child who had never once in her life spoken above a whisper, looked directly at the woman who owned her and began to speak. She spoke about the darkness she had been in, cold, still, timeless, a place where she didn't need to breathe, didn't need to move, just existed in absolute nothing. And then a voice without sound offered her a choice: stay or go back. But if you go back, you have to finish something. You have to make them see. You have to show them what they did. Show them what we are worth. Show them you cannot throw people away like garbage and expect no consequences. The crowd of enslaved people had gone completely still, and something was moving through them. You could feel it, even in the descriptions passed down through generations. Not fear, something closer to recognition. Like they were watching something they had silently been waiting for without knowing how to ask for it. Briggs stepped forward with his rifle and pointed it at Sarah at point blank range. His voice cracked as he ordered her to be quiet. His finger tightened on the trigger. He fired. The bullet hit the ground 3 feet to her left. He raised the rifle again, aimed carefully, fired again. The shot went high by 2 feet. He fired a third time, a fourth, emptying the rifle. Every single shot missed. A man who could shoot a rabbit at 50 yards could not hit a stationary 9-year-old child at 10 feet. Each bullet curved away at the last possible moment, as if something invisible was bending the air between the gun and the girl. Briggs dropped the empty rifle. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold it. And when Sarah turned and looked at him with those impossible eyes and spoke his name, "You hit me many times, Mr. Briggs. You called me worthless. You were right about the dying part, but wrong about everything else." He turned and ran. This large, brutal, feared man ran from a child like something out of a nightmare, stumbling over his own feet and not looking back. Sarah didn't chase him. She just watched him go. Then she turned to the crowd of enslaved people, the people who had mourned her, who had carried her body, who had lived alongside her in suffering, and her voice became gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just Sarah, but something changed in me. Something showed me things, and I came back for the ones who decided our lives don't matter. The ones who treat us like numbers. It starts with them. It starts with the people who let a child die rather than spend $5 on medicine." Margaret tried to restore order, tried to invoke her authority, her ownership, the entire weight of the system that had given her power over these people's lives. But nobody moved. For the first time in her life, Margaret Sutton stood before enslaved people and felt completely, utterly powerless. Sarah looked around one final time. "Justice is coming to Blackwood Plantation," she said, "the kind that doesn't care about property laws or economics, the kind that balances scales no matter what it costs." Then she walked calmly through the parted crowd toward the quarters, her head up, her back straight, moving with a dignity she had never been allowed to possess in life. She went into the cabin, she lay down on her mat, and within minutes she was peacefully asleep. The days that followed were strange in ways that are hard to fully describe. Animals refused to go near Sarah. The plantation's dogs would bark from a distance, but cower if forced close, trembling and whimpering. Horses that had been calm and well trained for years would suddenly rear and bolt if Sarah came within 20 feet of them. The chickens closest to her cabin stopped laying eggs entirely and paced in obvious distress until they had to be moved before they died from the stress of whatever they were sensing. In the field where Sarah had collapsed, where she had fallen and not gotten back up on August 15th, a section of cotton plants about 20 feet across began to wither and die. The balls shriveled, the leaves curled and fell. Within a week, that circle of earth was completely barren, while everything around it grew normally. Workers refused to set foot in that area. They said the ground felt wrong, like it was watching them. And then people started getting sick. Dr. Merritt developed a persistent cough on August 20th. By the 21st, a fever. By the 22nd, he was in bed, listening to fluid building in his own lungs with a growing horror that went beyond physical fear. The symptoms were identical to what had killed Sarah. The man who had written entry number 437 in his ledger now lay in bed wondering if he would become an entry himself, and who would write it and what it would say. Margaret became withdrawn, barely sleeping, sitting at her desk staring at ledgers she could no longer make sense of. The numbers that had always given her comfort, that had always told her exactly where she stood, suddenly seemed to mean nothing. What were they measuring exactly? What was any of it worth? And Briggs, the man who had broken bones and souls for 6 years at Blackwood without losing a single night's sleep, barricaded himself in his room, pushed furniture against the door, loaded every gun he owned. He kept lamps burning through the night. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like small footsteps. Every movement of curtains in the breeze looked like a small figure standing in the corner. He was afraid of the dark for the first time in his adult life. I want to stop here for just a moment and tell you something. I have spent a long time with this story, and what strikes me most is not the impossibility of what Sarah did. It's not the bullets that missed, or the grave she climbed out of, or the animals that reacted to her presence with primal fear. What strikes me most is this: the people who held power at Blackwood Plantation, Margaret with her ledgers, Briggs with his rifle, Dr. Merritt with his medical authority, had built their entire world on the certainty that they were in control, that they could calculate every variable, that they could put a price on anything, that they could make any problem disappear by choosing not to spend money on it. And then a 9-year-old girl climbed out of the ground and showed them that some things cannot be calculated. Some things cannot be controlled. Some debts accumulate silently, invisibly, in the spaces between ledger entries, and eventually, in ways that cannot be predicted or managed, they come due. Sarah had been told her whole short life that she was worth $250, that her labor didn't justify her food, that her death was a business loss of $250, maybe useful as a tax write-off. She had been told in every possible language that she did not matter, and she came back anyway. She came back with clarity in her eyes that she had never possessed in life. She came back and stood in front of the woman who owned her and said, simply, "I know what I am worth now. I am worth more than your whole plantation, because I walked through death and returned, and you cannot put a price on that. Now here's what I need you to really hear, and I mean this down to your bones. Sarah Sutton's story is impossible. I am not going to stand here and tell you I can explain it scientifically, because I cannot. Dr. Merritt couldn't explain it. The most rational, calculating people at Blackwood Plantation couldn't explain it. What I can tell you is this: the communities that remembered Sarah's story, that passed it down in whispers through generations, didn't remember it as a ghost story or a horror tale. They remembered it as proof that the system of slavery, with all its ledgers and calculations and carefully maintained economic logic, was built on a lie. The lie that human beings can be assigned a monetary value. The lie that a life can be weighed against a $5 investment and found wanting. The lie that you can let a child die for financial reasons and call it God's will and sleep peacefully afterward. Sarah Sutton couldn't change the whole system by climbing out of one grave in Mississippi in 1856. She was 9 years old. She weighed 50 pounds. The machinery of slavery was enormous and deeply embedded, and would require a civil war and hundreds of thousands of deaths to even begin dismantling. But she could stand in front of the woman who owned her, with grave dirt still in her hair and those ancient knowing eyes, and say, "You are wrong about what we are worth. You have always been wrong, and I came back to make sure you know it, and something about that, the sheer, impossible defiance of it, is why the story survived. Why people kept telling it long after Blackwood Plantation crumbled, long after Margaret Sutton's ledgers turned to dust, long after everyone who was there that hot August night was gone. Because some stories are too important to stay buried, even when everything and everyone tries to bury them. Even when you are 9 years old and 50 pounds, and the whole world has decided you are worth less than a decent horse.